So, you've definitely seen the name Boko Haram splashed across headlines for years, right? And it's almost always tied to religious extremism. But here's the thing. That's not even close to the whole story. Today, we're going to peel back those headlines and get to the real colonial roots of this conflict. We're talking about a straight line from British imperial policy over 100 years ago, all the way to the violence we see in Nigeria today. All right, let's dive in.
Okay, so the name itself, Boko Haram, it's almost always translated as Western education is forbidden. And you know, that translation is incredibly powerful. It's pretty much defined how the world sees this group as this movement that's just fundamentally at war with modernity itself.
But is that really the whole story? I mean, if we just stop there at that one translation, we're missing something huge, something way deeper and way more complex. It means we're probably not even asking the most important questions.
So, to really get a handle on this violence, we have to peel back the layers. We need to look right past the religious ideology and dig into the deep historical forces that have been shaping this region for well over a century.
Now, before we jump in our time machine and go back to the colonial era, let's start with the more immediate stuff. What was it that created such fertile ground for an insurgency like this to sprout and just explode? Well, the source we're looking at calls it a profound state of neglect.
Just look at the reality on the ground in northeastern Nigeria. We're talking about deep, chronic poverty, huge numbers of young people with no jobs, practically no schools or healthcare to speak of, and on top of all that, massive government corruption. And this isn't just some tragic accident or bad luck. The source argues that this is the direct result of decades of deliberate government neglect, a kind of structural violence inflicted on the entire region.
And right into that vacuum steps the movement's founder, Muhammad Yusuf. His message was absolutely explosive, not just because it was religious, but because it was a direct political assault. He pointed the finger at the northern elite, accusing them of being part of a corrupt system that was robbing people of any chance at justice or a decent life. You can imagine how much that resonated. It gave a name to people's suffering. It wasn't their fault. It was the system's fault.
The slide from protest to all-out insurgency was shockingly fast. It all started in the early 2000s as this social critique, but the real turning point was 2009. The Nigerian state cracked down hard. Yusuf was captured and then executed by security forces. That single act of state violence was like throwing gasoline on a fire. A new leader took over, the tactics got way more brutal, and the state's own heavy-handed response just trapped them both in this horrible escalating cycle of violence and revenge.
But all this brings up a massive question, right? Why was the Northeast so neglected in the first place? Why was the state basically a no-show there for so long? To get that answer, we got to rewind the clock. The whole stage was set back in the colonial era. And here we get to the absolute core argument of our source material. The deep, painful cracks in Nigeria today, especially the ones tearing the Northeast apart, they can be traced right back to what the essay calls the colonial architecture. That's the literal blueprint the British used to build and control the territory we now call Nigeria. You see, the British didn't govern Nigeria like it was one single place. Nope. They basically ran two completely different operations at the same time. In the north, which was predominantly Muslim, they used a system called indirect rule. They propped up the local emirs, kept Islamic governance in place, and, this is key, they severely restricted Western education to keep things just as they were. But then you look at the South, and it's the total opposite. They appointed their own local chiefs and let Christian missionaries go to town, opening schools, creating a whole new class of educated people to run the colonial machine.
The long-term impact of this divide-and-rule strategy was, frankly, devastating. This wasn't just about making administration easier for them. It was a policy that actively engineered division. It created these deep-seated regional inequalities and a really fractured sense of what it even meant to be Nigerian. And most importantly, it left the North, and especially the far Northeast, institutionally and educationally underdeveloped. That's a structural problem that has never gone away.
Okay, so how does this colonial history actually give a lifeline to a modern-day insurgency? It seems like a leap, but it's not. Let's connect the dots from that old colonial blueprint to what's happening on the ground today.
That historical neglect didn't just disappear when Nigeria got its independence in 1960. It festered, it deepened, and it created what our source calls a governance vacuum. I mean, for generations, the state just wasn't a positive or meaningful force in people's lives in the Northeast. It failed to provide the absolute basics: security, justice, or any real opportunity. And as we all know, nature abhors a vacuum, and so does politics. Boko Haram walked right in and filled that void. And this is so important. They built their power not just with guns, but by actually providing things the state wouldn't or couldn't. We're talking basic food and healthcare, settling local arguments, offering a sense of purpose to young men who had nothing. In doing all that, they became this twisted but effective alternative government.
This is exactly why this insurgency has been so incredibly hard to defeat. It's not just one thing, it's this toxic cocktail of local failure, that governance vacuum we just talked about, mixed with all this regional instability. You've got porous borders that let fighters and weapons just flow across. You've got links to global terror networks that provide money and ideas. It's a deeply local problem, but it's fueled by regional and international forces.
So, when you look at this deep, tangled history, you have to ask, where do we possibly go from here? Well, the essay we're digging into doesn't just point out the problem. It actually proposes a really challenging path forward, one that would require nothing less than a full-on historical reckoning. And this might be its most provocative point. It argues that any chance at a lasting peace has to involve some form of historical reparations. Now, let's be clear. The author isn't talking about blaming colonial officials who are long gone. It's about acknowledging what the source calls the structural continuity between past injustices and present conditions. In other words, the past isn't really past.
So what does reparations even mean in this context? It's not just a vague idea. The source actually breaks it down into a three-part plan. First, on a local level, massive targeted investments to actually rebuild the Northeast. Second, on a national level, a meaningful reallocation of Nigeria's resources to fix that historic imbalance. And finally, and this is a big one, you'd need the international community to honestly acknowledge the role that colonialism played in creating this mess in the first place.
So there you have it. We've literally traced a line from a dusty old colonial policy all the way to the brutal violence happening in northeastern Nigeria right now. And it leaves us with this one really tough question to sit with. Can you ever build a lasting peace, anywhere, if the very foundation you're building on is cracked and broken by the damage of the past? It's something to think about. Thanks for joining me.